Clear out your desk by 5 p.m., Victor said with a cold smile, leaning back in his imported leather chair. We appreciate your work on the Zenith contract, but with the deal closed, we're moving in a different direction. His eyes held no remorse, only calculation. I maintained perfect composure as my heart raced. The same $15 million Zenith contract I personally secured last week? I asked quietly. Victor waved dismissively. Let's not get confused about who did what. Meridian Solutions. Close that deal, not you personally. Little did he know, I wasn't just being fired from the company that had exploited my talents for years. I was one of its silent owners. And Monday's board meeting would be very interesting indeed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light streaming through his corner office windows caught the silver in his expertly colored hair and reflected off the array of industry awards displayed prominently behind him. Awards earned through others' efforts, primarily mine. We appreciate your work on the Zenith contract, but with the deal closed, we're moving in a different direction. His eyes held no remorse, only calculation. The practiced delivery suggested he'd terminated enough careers to perfect the art of dismissal. I maintained perfect composure as my heart raced beneath my carefully selected navy suit. 7 years at Meridian Solutions had taught me how to mask my emotions, especially in this glass-walled office where curious eyes could observe every reaction. The same $15 million Zenith contract I personally secured last week? I asked quietly, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. Victor waved dismissively, a gesture I'd seen countless times when he wanted to minimize others' contributions. Let's not get confused about who did what, Elise. Meridian Solutions. Close that deal, not you personally. The irony was almost laughable. I had cultivated the relationship with Zenith Technologies for 3 years. I had identified their expansion needs before their own executive team fully articulated them. I had crafted the proposal that transformed their operations across 5 countries. When their CEO wavered at the last minute, it was my 2 a.m. call that salvaged everything. Yet here was Victor, who had attended precisely 2 meetings and 1 dinner, claiming institutional credit while erasing my individual contribution. It was a familiar pattern, but today it carried a particularly bitter edge. I understand, I said, surprising myself with my calm. Because I did understand, not just this termination, but something much larger that had been building for years. When would you like me to transition my other accounts? Victor glanced at his Swiss watch. A recent purchase he'd mentioned came from his deal-closing bonus. My deal, his bonus. That won't be necessary. Aiden will take over the Zenith implementation, and Natalie will handle your other accounts. Of course, Aiden, Victor's golf partner and drinking buddy who had contributed nothing to the Zenith deal but would now manage its lucrative implementation phase. And Natalie, whose primary qualification seemed to be laughing at Victor's jokes and acting, suitably impressed by his business insights. I've already briefed them this morning, Victor continued, not meeting my eyes as he shuffled papers on his desk. HR has your separation package, standard terms, 3-month severance, continuation of benefits, the usual confidentiality clauses. Through the glass walls, I could see HR Director Melissa hovering nearby, separation folder in hand, her expression a practiced blend of professional detachment and manufactured sympathy. I should have felt devastated. 7 years of my professional life discarded in a 3-minute conversation. The $15 million contract that should have been my crowning achievement now becoming someone else's success story. The client relationships I had carefully built now handed to colleagues who hadn't earned them. Instead, a strange calm settled over me, a clarity I hadn't expected. I see, I said simply. And the commission structure we discussed for the Zenith deal? Victor's expression hardened slightly. As I've explained before, business development bonuses are calculated quarterly based on team performance. Since you won't be with the company at quarter's end, you'll receive the standard deal contribution percentage outlined in your employment agreement. Translation: the substantial commission I'd been promised, the reason I'd worked 80-hour weeks for months, would be reduced to a fraction, with the difference likely redistributed to the team, meaning Victor and his favorites. I nodded slowly, rising from my chair with deliberate grace. I understand perfectly. Look, Elise, Victor said, his tone shifting to the false warmth he used when playing the mentor. This isn't personal. You've done solid work here. I'm happy to serve as a reference. But Meridian needs people who understand their place in the organizational ecosystem, team players who support the leadership vision. What he meant, of course, was that Meridian, or rather Victor, needed people who wouldn't outshine him. People who would generate results without expecting appropriate credit or compensation. People who would remain silent when their ideas, clients, and commissions were appropriated by those above them. For 7 years I had been that person. Not anymore. I appreciate the offer, I said with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. I'll clear out my things right away, though I imagine Monday's board meeting will be interesting. A flash of confusion crossed Victor's face. The board meeting is just standard quarterly review, nothing that concerns you at this point. Of course, I replied, turning to leave. Best of luck with the Zenith implementation. They can be particular about who manages their accounts. I walked out with measured steps, past curious colleagues who quickly averted their gazes, past the wall of client testimonials featuring my work but never my name, past the trophy case highlighting Meridian's team achievements that had been primarily my achievements. At my desk, I found a cardboard box, the universal symbol of corporate dismissal, already placed in my chair. Melissa from HR hovered nearby, ready to ensure I didn't take anything beyond personal effects. I'm sorry about this, Elise, she whispered, glancing around to ensure no one could hear her momentary departure from the HR script. It's not right. What's happening? I smiled genuinely this time. Thank you, Melissa, but I'm going to be fine. Better than fine, actually. She looked confused but nodded sympathetically, clearly interpreting my response as brave facing a devastating setback. As I placed my few personal items in the box, a family photo, a plant, a few books, I felt oddly liberated. The anxiety and frustration that had become my constant companions over the past few years seemed to dissipate with each possession I packed. My phone vibrated with an incoming message. It was from Roberto, our chief counsel. Just heard. Need I to talk ASAP. Coffee shop across street in 20? I texted back a simple yes before continuing to clear my desk. Roberto's timing wasn't coincidental. As Meridian's legal advisor, he would have been consulted about my termination and would understand its implications better than Victor apparently did. Melissa escorted me to the elevator, company policy dictating that terminated employees couldn't be trusted to exit without supervision. As the doors closed, I caught a final glimpse of the Meridian Solutions logo prominently displayed in the reception area. Building tomorrow's solutions today. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 7 years, I had built Meridian's tomorrow while sacrificing my today. I had generated over $50 million in business while watching others claim the rewards. I had remained silent as Victor and his inner circle built careers on my ideas, my client relationships, and my results. But they had made a critical miscalculation. This wasn't just about the Zenith contract, though that would have been reason enough for grievance. This was about what Victor and the executive team didn't know, what they had never bothered to investigate. I wasn't just a dispensable business development director who had outlived her usefulness. I was Elise Winters, silent investor in Meridian Solutions through Aurora Ventures, the investment firm I had established with my inheritance 5 years ago. My 17% ownership stake had been carefully structured through offshore entities to remain anonymous, a privacy measure my late father had insisted upon. For years, I had watched from within as the company I partially owned misallocated resources, mistreated talent, and undermined its own potential through politics and favoritism. I had hoped to change the culture through example and performance. That approach had clearly failed. As I stepped onto the street, the spring sunshine felt different somehow, brighter, more immediate. 7 years of playing by someone else's broken rules had ended. Now I would play by my own. I texted my assistant Susan, who also managed my external business affairs. Operation Daybreak is active. Call Aurora board. Meeting tomorrow, 9 a.m. Her response came immediately. Already on it. Documents prepared. Helix Group representatives confirmed. I smiled as I walked toward the coffee shop where Roberto waited. Victor thought he was cutting dead weight by firing me just after I'd secured Meridian's largest contract to date. Instead, he had just freed me to take my rightful place, not as an undervalued employee, but as an owner prepared to transform the company from the top down. Monday's board meeting would be interesting indeed. Roberto was waiting at a corner table when I arrived at Café Laurent, 2 steaming cups already in front of him. At 58, with salt and pepper hair and perpetually tired eyes, Meridian's chief counsel had the weary demeanor of someone who had witnessed too many corporate injustices to maintain illusions about executive integrity. I ordered your usual, he said, pushing a cappuccino toward me as I sat down, though perhaps today calls for something stronger. This is perfect, I replied, wrapping my hands around the warm cup. Thank you for meeting me. Roberto glanced around to ensure we weren't within earshot of anyone from Meridian before leaning forward. Victor made a catastrophic mistake today. You know that, right? I nodded, taking a sip of my coffee. Not his first, but certainly his most significant. Elise, I've been practicing corporate law for 30 years. I've seen every form of mismanagement imaginable, but this... He shook his head in disbelief. Terminating the executive who just secured a $15 million contract without board consultation, 2 days before quarterly review, with no transition plan for the client relationship? And just 3 days before the identity of Aurora Ventures' primary stakeholder is revealed to the board, I added quietly. Roberto's eyebrows shot up. That's still happening Monday? I assumed you might delay given today's developments. On the contrary, I said, feeling a surprising sense of calm. Today's events make Monday's revelation all the more necessary. For 5 years, I had maintained my anonymity as a significant Meridian shareholder. It wasn't about deception. It was about understanding the company from the inside, uncolored by the deference people show to ownership. My father, before his passing, had taught me that lesson through his own business ventures. Capital gives you a seat at the table, but knowledge of what happens when you're not in the room gives you actual power. The arrangement had been meticulously legal. Aurora Ventures, the investment firm I'd established with my inheritance, had acquired 17% of Meridian Solutions during a capital raise 5 years ago. The paperwork disclosed that Aurora's primary stakeholder would remain anonymous for a fixed term, with full identity disclosure scheduled for the board meeting next Monday. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Only a handful of people knew the truth. Roberto, who had handled the legal structure, my assistant Susan, who managed my private affairs, and the 3 trustees of Aurora Ventures who had maintained the corporate veil on my behalf. Victor has no idea, does he? Roberto asked, a rare smile playing at the corners of his mouth. None whatsoever, I confirmed. He never bothered to learn about Meridian's ownership structure beyond the executive team's stake. He assumes Aurora is just another institutional investor, probably hasn't given it a second thought. And now he's terminated you without cause, after you delivered the largest contract in the company's history, while reassigning your commission structure in violation of your employment agreement. Roberto's smile broadened. If I weren't bound by attorney-client privilege, I'd pay good money to see his face on Monday. I couldn't help but smile in return. The termination isn't what concerns me, Roberto. It's what it represents about Meridian's culture under Victor's leadership. That's what I intend to address on Monday. Roberto's expression sobered. You should know, Elise, that this isn't an isolated incident. Since Victor became COO last year, we've lost 6 high-performing team members, all replaced by people connected to him personally. The Zenith Commission isn't the first he's redistributed, just the largest. Meanwhile, overhead has increased 42%, primarily in executive compensation and strategic consulting, from firms with ties to our senior leadership. None of this surprised me, but hearing it laid out so clinically reinforced the necessity of what I was planning. For years, I had witnessed Victor's strategic undermining of Meridian's culture, replacing merit with loyalty, results with optics, innovation with conformity. I've prepared a briefing document, Roberto continued, sliding a sealed envelope across the table. Everything you'll need for Monday, including the financial record showing the pattern of mismanagement. I've also included the legal assessment of your termination. In short, it's indefensible, particularly given the timing and the Zenith contract. I took the envelope, oddly touched by Roberto's thoroughness. Why are you helping me like this? You're Meridian's counsel, not mine personally. Roberto looked at me steadily. I represent the company's best interests, not Victor's. Those two things have increasingly diverged. You've been inside Meridian for 7 years, Elise. You've seen the shift. This isn't the company I signed on with a decade ago. He wasn't wrong. When I joined Meridian Solutions, it had been an innovative force in enterprise software, known for its creative approach to business challenges and its meritocratic culture. Employees shared in the company's success through generous bonus structures and equity opportunities. Innovation was celebrated regardless of where in the organization it originated. That culture had eroded steadily over the past 4 years, accelerating dramatically since Victor's promotion to COO. Bonuses were increasingly concentrated among senior leadership. Recognition flowed to those with the right connections rather than those delivering results. Innovation was suppressed when it didn't align with Victor's vision, or worse, when it emerged from someone he perceived as a threat. What will you do after Monday? Roberto asked, interrupting my thoughts. I considered the question carefully. That depends on the board's response. My preference is to restructure leadership rather than clean house entirely. Meridian still has extraordinary potential and talented people. They just need the right environment to thrive. Roberto nodded approvingly. And Victor? He'll have the opportunity to demonstrate he can adapt to new leadership parameters, I said diplomatically. We both knew what that meant. Victor would almost certainly fail to adjust to any system where he couldn't manipulate outcomes to his personal advantage. As we finished our coffee, my phone buzzed with a message from Susan. Helix Group CEO confirmed for 2 p.m. meeting tomorrow. Their proposal is ready for review. I showed Roberto the message, watching his eyebrows raise in surprise. Helix? They're Zenith's primary competitor. Are you thinking what I think you're thinking? Zenith signed with Meridian largely because of my personal involvement, I explained. They made that clear throughout the process. With me gone and the account handed to Aiden, who has 0 experience in their industry sector, there's a significant risk they'll reconsider their commitment. And Helix would be happy to step in with a competing offer, Roberto concluded, understanding dawning on his face. Especially if that offer came with the guarantee of your personal oversight. The Zenith contract has a 14-day review period before final execution, I reminded him. Victor seems to have forgotten that detail in his haste to remove me. Roberto shook his head, a mixture of admiration and concern in his expression. "You're several moves ahead on the chessboard. Just be careful, Elise. Victor may be short-sighted, but he's vindictive. When he realizes what's happening, he won't go quietly." "I'm counting on that," I said, rising from the table. "His reaction will reveal exactly why Meridian needs new leadership." As I left the cafe, the weight of the envelope in my bag felt like possibility rather than burden. For 7 years, I had worked within a system increasingly stacked against merit and integrity. I had believed I could change it from within through exemplary performance and quiet persistence. That approach had failed. It was time for a more direct intervention. Back in my apartment, I reviewed Roberto's briefing document with growing resolve. The pattern of mismanagement was even more extensive than I'd realized. Executive compensation had increased 58% in 2 years, while overall employee compensation had decreased 7%, accounting for inflation. Client retention had fallen 23% under Victor's leadership, masked by aggressive new business acquisition that showed impressive top-line growth but deteriorating profitability. Most disturbing was the section on talent management. Every senior hire in the past 18 months had some connection to Victor. Former colleagues, business school classmates, even his wife's cousin brought in as marketing director despite having no software industry experience. Meanwhile, high performers without such connections were systematically marginalized, eventually leaving or, in my case, being pushed out entirely. I spent the remainder of the evening preparing for tomorrow's meetings, reviewing the Zenith contract, terms to confirm my recollection of the review period, and outlining my strategy for Monday's board presentation. By midnight, I had a comprehensive plan that addressed both immediate issues and longer-term strategic realignment. As I finally prepared for bed, my phone chimed with an unexpected message from Natalie, the junior account manager Victor had assigned to take over my client relationships. "Just heard what happened. It's not right. Most of the team feels the same way. Let me know if there's anything I can do." I stared at the message in surprise. Natalie had always seemed firmly in Victor's camp, laughing at his jokes, supporting his initiatives, adapting her views to align with his. Perhaps I had misjudged her, or perhaps Victor's inner circle was less cohesive than it appeared. Either way, her message represented something important. Not everyone at Meridian had accepted the corrupted culture. There were still people who recognized injustice when they saw it, who maintained their integrity despite the environment. Those were the people worth fighting for. Those were the people who could help rebuild Meridian into the company it was meant to be. I replied simply, "Thank you, Natalie. Stay strong and watch for Monday's board meeting outcome. Things are about to change." As I drifted toward sleep, I found myself reflecting on my father's words when he first suggested I consider anonymous investment in Meridian. True leadership isn't about titles or public recognition. It's about having the right influence at the right time for the right reasons. Tomorrow would test that philosophy in ways neither of us could have anticipated. But for the first time in years, I felt fully aligned with my purpose and completely confident in my path forward. The game had changed, and I was finally playing by my own rules. Saturday morning arrived with unexpected clarity. I woke before my alarm, the kind of natural awakening that comes with purpose rather than obligation. For the first time in years, I wasn't rushing to catch up on Meridian work, wasn't checking emails before my feet hit the floor, wasn't mentally rehearsing explanations for why client deliverables were delayed due to understaffing. Instead, I savored my morning coffee on my balcony overlooking the city, watching as the early spring sunshine gradually illuminated the skyline. The Meridian Solutions building stood prominent among the downtown towers, its distinctive blue glass exterior reflecting the morning light. For 7 years, that building had been the center of my professional universe. My ambitions, frustrations, and accomplishments all contained within its walls. Now I saw it differently. Not as the definition of my career, but simply as one piece. In a larger landscape, I was finally able to fully perceive. At precisely 8:55 a.m., my laptop chimed with an incoming video call. I straightened my posture and adjusted my webcam before accepting the connection. "Good morning, Elise," greeted Margaret. Chen, the formidable chairperson of Aurora Ventures' Board of Trustees. At 72, with impeccable credentials spanning 4 decades in corporate governance, Margaret had been my father's trusted advisor and had become mine after his passing. Flanking her on the split screen were James Whitfield and Dr. Amara Okafor, the other Aurora trustees who had maintained the corporate veil on my behalf for 5 years. "Thank you all for convening on such short notice," I began, my voice steadier than I had anticipated. "As you know, circumstances at Meridian have developed significantly." For the next 30 minutes, I briefed them on my termination, the Zenith contract situation, and Roberto's insights into the broader pattern of mismanagement under Victor's leadership. The trustees listened attentively, occasionally asking incisive questions that helped clarify my thinking about Monday's approach. "So, to summarize," Margaret said when I had finished, "you were terminated without cause immediately after securing the largest contract in company history, with your commission structure retroactively modified, and without board consultation, despite your revenue-critical role." "That's correct," I confirmed. "And you believe this represents not just personal injustice, but symptomatic failure of governance and leadership culture that threatens Meridian's long-term viability." Precisely. The Zenith situation is merely the most visible manifestation of systemic problems. Margaret exchanged glances with her fellow trustees before turning back to me. "Elise, when your father and I structured Aurora's investment in Meridian, we anticipated you might eventually take a more active governance role. We didn't anticipate it would come through such dramatic circumstances. Life rarely follows our anticipated script," I replied with a small smile. "Indeed," Margaret acknowledged. "The question now is strategy. Monday's disclosure of your ownership position is contractually fixed. How you leverage that moment is where strategy becomes critical." Dr. Okafor, whose background in organizational psychology made her particularly attuned to leadership dynamics, leaned forward. "Victor Harrington will perceive this as a personal affront, a power play rather than a governance correction. His response will be defensive and potentially destructive." "I'm counting on that," I admitted. "His reaction will demonstrate exactly why leadership change is necessary." James Whitfield, the financial specialist among the trustees, had been reviewing the documentation Roberto had provided. "These financial patterns are troubling. Executive compensation increasing while operational budgets tighten, strategic investments redirected to initiatives connected to senior leadership, client retention declining while acquisition costs rise. Classic indicators of leadership serving itself rather than the organization. Or its shareholders," Margaret added pointedly. "Which brings us to Monday's approach," I said, pulling up a document on my screen to share with them. "I've outlined 3 scenarios based on potential board reactions to the ownership disclosure and my termination." The trustees reviewed my strategic framework with professional thoroughness, suggesting refinements to my approach and raising potential complications I hadn't fully considered. By the end of our discussion, we had aligned on a clear approach for Monday's meeting, one that prioritized organizational health over personal vindication. "Remember, Elise," Margaret cautioned as our meeting concluded, "the goal isn't to punish Victor or even to reclaim your position. It's to realign Meridian with its core values and potential. Keep that focus, and you'll make decisions that serve both the organization and your investment." "Understood," I replied, grateful for her wisdom. "And thank you all for your continued support." As the video call ended, I checked my watch. Just enough time to prepare for my 2 p.m. meeting with Helix Group. I spent the intervening hours meticulously reviewing the Zenith contract. identifying the specific elements that would be most at risk without my direct involvement. By the time I arrived at Helix's downtown offices, I had a comprehensive understanding of both the vulnerabilities in Meridian's position and the opportunities they presented. Carson Williams, Helix's CEO, greeted me in the reception area himself, rather than sending an assistant, a small but significant indication of how seriously they were taking this meeting. "Elise, thank you for coming," he said, extending his hand. "I must say, your call yesterday was unexpected, but intriguing." "I appreciate you making time on a Saturday," I replied as he led me toward their conference room. "For the opportunity you described? I'd have met at midnight in a parking garage," he said with a chuckle that didn't entirely mask his eagerness. The conference room contained a small group of Helix executives, their CTO, CFO, and head of business development. After brief introductions, Carson got straight to the point. "So, Meridian landed Zenith with a $15 million implementation contract, then immediately terminated the executive who secured the deal, you, leaving Zenith in the hands of someone with no experience in their industry. Have I got that right?" "That's an accurate summary of the situation," I confirmed. "And Zenith has a 14-day review period before the contract is finalized," added Sandra Miles, Helix's business development director, "which means they could still walk away without penalty." "Correct. The review period was designed to allow final technical verification and stakeholder alignment," I explained. "Given my termination, I believe Zenith will have legitimate concerns about Meridian's ability to deliver as promised." Carson leaned forward, eyes intensely focused. "And you're suggesting we present an alternative proposal to Zenith during this window of uncertainty, with you involved as a strategic advisor," I clarified. "I'm not looking for employment, Carson. I'm looking for partnership that serves both Helix and Zenith appropriately." The Helix team exchanged glances, a mixture of excitement and caution evident in their expressions. "We've prepared an initial framework," Sandra said, sliding a tablet across the table to me, "based on what we know of Zenith's requirements and our capabilities." I reviewed their proposal carefully. It was impressive in its technical specifications, but missed several crucial aspects of Zenith's organizational culture and strategic priorities that I had incorporated into the Meridian solution. "This is a solid foundation," I acknowledged, "but it needs significant refinement to truly address what made Zenith choose Meridian's approach." For the next hour, I walked them through the subtleties of Zenith's needs, the unspoken priorities that went beyond technical specifications, the cultural factors that influenced their decision-making, the historical concerns that had shaped their vendor selection process. The Helix team took notes furiously, occasionally exchanging impressed glances as I revealed insights about a potential client they had pursued unsuccessfully for years. "You understand them at a level we never achieved," Carson admitted when I finished. "That's why they chose Meridian, isn't it? Not the technical solution itself, but your understanding of their underlying needs." "Essentially, yes," I confirmed. "The technical components can be replicated by several vendors. The strategic alignment is what differentiated the offering." Sandra was already revising their proposal based on my input, her fingers flying across her tablet. "If we incorporate these elements, adjust the implementation timeline to prioritize their legacy system integration, and structure the governance model to match their internal processes, then you have a compelling alternative that addresses both their explicit requirements and their underlying concerns," I completed her thought. Carson studied me with newfound respect. "And what do you want from this, Elise? If we secure Zenith with your guidance, what's your expected outcome?" It was the question I'd been anticipating, the one that would define whether this partnership could work. "3 things," I said, holding up my fingers to enumerate them. "First, a strategic advisory fee structured as a percentage of the contract value. Second, acknowledgement of my role in developing the solution approach, both to Zenith and in any public communications. And third, most importantly, a commitment to deliver exactly what Zenith needs, not just what looks good on a quarterly report. Carson nodded slowly, considering my terms. The first two are standard enough. The third tells me this isn't just about business for you. It's about integrity. Correct, I confirmed. I've spent 3 years understanding Zenith's needs. I won't be part of disappointing them, regardless of which company name is on the contract. I think we can work with those terms, Carson said after a brief consultation with his CFO. Sandra will finalize the revised proposal by tomorrow morning. If you approve it, we can approach Zenith's CEO on Monday. That timeline works well. With my other commitments, I agreed, thinking of Monday's board meeting at Meridian. As the meeting concluded and handshakes were exchanged, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was vindication, certainly, validation that my understanding of Zenith's needs was valuable beyond Meridian's walls. There was strategic satisfaction in creating a viable alternative that could benefit all parties. But there was also a tinge of regret that it had come to this, that Meridian's leadership failures might cost them their most significant client opportunity. We'll be in touch tomorrow with the revised proposal, Carson said as he walked me to the elevator. And Elise, whatever happens with Meridian and their board meeting on Monday, Helix would be interested in discussing longer-term possibilities with you. I smiled politely. Let's focus on serving Zenith correctly first. The future will take care of itself. As I left the Helix building, the afternoon sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the city streets. My phone buzzed with a message from Susan. Zenith CEO requesting call with you. Says it's urgent regarding contract implementation. Perfect timing. The pieces were falling into place faster than I had anticipated. I stepped into a nearby park, finding a quiet bench before returning the call. Richard Dawson, Zenith's CEO, answered on the first ring. Elise, thank you for calling back so quickly, he began without preamble. I've just received a concerning email from Meridian introducing someone named Aiden as our new account lead. What's happening? I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. Richard, I was terminated from Meridian yesterday, immediately, after the Zenith contract was signed. The company has decided to take the implementation in a different direction. Silence hung on the line for several seconds before Richard responded, his voice tight with controlled anger. That was not our understanding when we signed. You were the primary reason we selected Meridian over competitors. Your understanding of our needs was the differentiating factor. I understand your concern, I replied calmly, and I appreciate your candor about my role in your decision. You should know that you're still within the 14-day review period specified in Section 7(3) of the contract. I'm aware, he said grimly. My legal team is reviewing our options as we speak. Elise, can you tell me, is there any chance of resolving this situation? Your return to Meridian to oversee our implementation as originally understood? That seems unlikely at this point, I answered honestly. However, I would recommend not making any hasty decisions until after Monday. There are board-level discussions scheduled that may impact the situation. Richard sighed heavily. I'll hold off until Tuesday then. But Elise, to be completely transparent, without your involvement, we will likely exercise our option to withdraw during the review period. Zenith cannot risk a $15 million implementation being handed to someone unfamiliar with our ecosystem. As we ended the call, I felt a curious sense of calm. The conversation confirmed what I had already known. Zenith's commitment was to the understanding and approach I had developed, not to Meridian as an institution. Victor's decision to remove me immediately after contract signing demonstrated either staggering arrogance or complete misunderstanding of the client relationship. Either way, Monday's board meeting had just gained another significant dimension. Not only would I be revealed as a major shareholder, but Meridian's largest contract would be hanging in the balance, directly tied to my continued involvement. The board would face a stark choice: support Victor's decision to terminate me and likely lose the Zenith contract, or acknowledge the error and find a way to maintain my involvement despite his actions. As the sun set over the city skyline, I walked home with renewed purpose. Tomorrow would be for final preparations. Monday would be for restoration, not just of my position, but of the values and vision that had made Meridian worth investing in 5 years ago. Victor had fired me thinking he was eliminating competition. Instead, he had triggered a sequence of events that would either transform Meridian or reveal it as unable to be saved. Either way, my path forward was now clear. Sunday unfolded with methodical precision, each hour dedicated to strengthening my position for Monday's confrontation. I began at dawn with a 5-mile run along the riverfront, not just for physical preparation, but for mental clarity. The rhythmic impact of each stride against the pavement helped organize my thoughts, transforming nervous energy into focused determination. Back home, I transformed my dining room into a command center. 3 laptops arranged in a semicircle displayed different aspects of my preparation. One for the Aurora Ventures documentation, one for the Meridian financial analysis Roberto had provided, and one for my ongoing communication with potential allies. By mid-morning, Susan arrived with additional materials. At 32, with a master's in business administration and unparalleled organizational skills, Susan had been my executive assistant at Meridian before transitioning to manage my personal business affairs when Aurora Ventures was formed. Her understanding of both worlds made her invaluable for what lay ahead. Helix sent their revised proposal, she announced, setting a sealed envelope on the table. And I've confirmed with Meridian's board secretary that tomorrow's meeting remains, scheduled for 10 a.m., with the Aurora Ventures disclosure still on the agenda. Any word from inside Meridian about my termination? I asked, reviewing the calendar she had prepared outlining tomorrow's critical timeline. Susan's expression tightened slightly. It's being positioned as a strategic realignment following successful completion of the Zenith acquisition. Victor sent an all-staff email yesterday afternoon announcing Aiden as the new Zenith account lead, with no mention of your contribution to securing the contract. I nodded, having expected nothing less. And reactions? Mixed. Public responses are cautious. People congratulating Aiden, expressing excitement about the Zenith partnership. But private channels tell a different story. I've received messages from 7 different Meridian employees expressing concern or outrage about your termination. This information was crucial. Understanding the internal landscape at Meridian would help me gauge how best to approach tomorrow's revelation. If significant portions of the staff already questioned Victor's decision, it would create fertile ground for the changes I hoped to implement. What about Richard Dawson at Zenith? Any further communication? Susan checked her notes. He's requested a formal meeting with Meridian's leadership for Tuesday morning. The official purpose is implementation planning, but my contact in his office says it's really to evaluate whether they'll proceed without your involvement. I opened the envelope containing Helix's revised proposal, reviewing their adjustments. Based on our meeting yesterday, they had incorporated my insights admirably, creating an alternative that truly addressed Zenith's core needs rather than simply matching Meridian's technical specifications. This is good work, I noted, passing the proposal to Susan. Have this ready as a contingency, but hold on approaching Zenith directly until after tomorrow's board meeting. I want to give Meridian one chance to correct course before we present alternatives. Susan nodded, understanding the subtle ethics of my position. While I had every right to pursue opportunities with Helix given my termination, doing so before Meridian's board had the opportunity to address the situation would raise questions about my intentions. Timing mattered not just strategically but ethically. What's our confidence level in the board's reaction? Susan asked, articulating the question that had been circling in my mind all weekend. I considered carefully before answering. Meridian's board consisted of 7 members, Victor and CEO Lawrence Bennett, representing executive leadership, venture capitalist Diane Morgan, and former tech executive James Harrison, who had both supported Victor's promotion to COO, retired professor Daniel Kwan and attorney Sofia Rodriguez, who generally aligned with Lawrence on strategic matters, and Aurora's representative, currently a professional board member named Thomas Blackwell, who had no knowledge of my connection to Aurora. "It's genuinely uncertain," I admitted. "The revelation of my ownership stake will shock everyone. The question is whether that shock transforms into receptiveness for the changes needed, or whether they circle the wagons around the current leadership structure. And if they choose the latter, then Meridian loses the Zenith contract, and we accelerate discussions with Helix about longer-term partnership," I replied calmly. "But my hope is for Meridian's transformation, not its destabilization." We spent the remainder of the morning refining my presentation for the board meeting, ensuring every allegation of mismanagement was supported by irrefutable evidence, every proposed solution was concrete and implementable, and every prediction about Zenith's reaction could be substantiated. At noon, we paused for a working lunch, reviewing messages from potential allies within Meridian. The most surprising came from Melissa in HR, who had sent documentation of 6 other questionable terminations under Victor's leadership, all high-performing employees who had challenged his authority or outshined him publicly. "This creates a pattern," I noted, adding the information to my presentation. "Victor systematically removes perceived threats regardless of their contribution to the company." As afternoon arrived, we shifted focus to my personal preparation. Susan arranged a video call with Margaret Chen to conduct a simulated board confrontation, with the venerable trustee playing various roles to help me prepare for potential reactions. "Remember, Elise," Margaret advised after our third simulation, "tomorrow isn't about vengeance or even justice in the conventional sense. It's about organizational health and alignment with original values. Keep your focus there rather than on Victor's individual transgressions, and board members will find it harder to dismiss your concerns as personally motivated." "Even though they are, in part, personally motivated," I acknowledged wryly. Margaret's expression softened momentarily. "Of course they are. You've been treated abominably. But effective leadership separates personal injury from organizational necessity. Your father understood that distinction, and I believe you do too." Her invocation of my father's leadership philosophy centered me. Henry Winters had built 3 successful companies without ever making business personal, even when competitors or colleagues had done him wrong. He evaluated every situation based on organizational health rather than individual grievance. "Thank you for the reminder," I said sincerely. "I'll approach tomorrow with that perspective." By late afternoon, we had addressed every aspect of tactical preparation. The documents were organized, the presentation was polished, and the contingency plans were in place. All that remained was the most challenging preparation of all: emotional readiness. I dismissed Susan with gratitude for her extraordinary efforts, promising to contact her with any developments before tomorrow's meeting. As the door closed behind her, I was finally alone with the magnitude of what lay ahead. 7 years at Meridian had shaped my professional identity. The relationships I'd built, the projects I'd led, the culture I'd participated in, all of it had become intrinsically connected to my sense of self. Even with the mistreatment I'd endured, the prospect of fundamental change carried emotional weight I needed to acknowledge. I poured myself a glass of wine and stepped onto my balcony as twilight settled over the city. The Meridian building stood illuminated against the darkening sky, its windows still showing signs of Sunday activity. Likely, Victor and his allies preparing their own strategy for the week ahead, unaware of the seismic shift awaiting them. My phone chimed with an unexpected message from Lawrence Bennett, Meridian's CEO. "Elise, just learned of your departure. Traveling internationally and was not consulted. Would value your perspective before making determinations. Available to talk?" This was an interesting development. Lawrence had always been more measured than Victor, more considered in his approach to management. His international travel explained why he might not have been involved in my termination decision, and his reaching out suggested he recognized the potential implications. I considered ignoring the message until after tomorrow's revelation, but decided transparency with Lawrence might create a valuable ally during the board meeting. I responded simply, "Available now for a brief call if convenient." Within minutes, my phone rang. Lawrence's voice came through clearly despite the international connection, his usual confident tone tinged with concern. "Elise, thank you for taking my call. I'm in Singapore for the Technology Summit and just received notification of your termination." The explanation I received seems incomplete. "What explanation were you given?" I asked, curious about Victor's framing. "That with the Zenith contract secured, we were realigning resources to optimize implementation, and your skills were better suited to acquisition than ongoing client management," Lawrence replied, his skepticism evident even through the phone. "But given the size of the Zenith deal and your relationship with their leadership, that explanation struck me as problematic." "It's certainly one interpretation of events," I said carefully, "though not the one Richard Dawson at Zenith seems to share, based on his reaction to my removal from the account." Lawrence's sharp intake of breath was audible. "Dawson has expressed concerns?" "He's requested a meeting on Tuesday to evaluate whether Zenith will proceed with the contract given my termination," I confirmed. "The 14-day review period gives them the option to withdraw without penalty." Silence hung on the line for several seconds before Lawrence spoke again, his voice now carrying a note of genuine alarm. "Elise, I need to understand what happened." Victor assured me the transition would be seamless. "I think tomorrow's board meeting will provide clarity," I replied, intentionally referencing the meeting without specifying my planned involvement. "The quarterly review should include a comprehensive update on the Zenith situation." "I'll be calling in remotely," Lawrence said. "The time difference is challenging, but this situation clearly requires direct attention." We spoke for a few more minutes, with Lawrence probing for details about my termination and the Zenith contract. I maintained a professional tone throughout, sharing facts without emotion and avoiding any mention of my Aurora connection or planned revelation. As we concluded the call, Lawrence made one final comment that suggested he understood more than he was explicitly acknowledging. "Meridian's success has always depended on recognizing and rewarding exceptional talent, Elise. Some recent decisions have diverged from that principle. Tomorrow may be an opportunity to realign." After hanging up, I considered the implications of this unexpected conversation. Lawrence's outreach suggested fissures in Meridian's executive unity, potential openings for the changes I hope to implement. His acknowledgement of recent decisions, diverging from core principles, aligned perfectly with the case I plan to present tomorrow. Perhaps most importantly, his participation in tomorrow's meeting, even remotely, meant another voice that might question Victor's unilateral actions. The dynamics were shifting in subtle but meaningful ways. As night fell completely, I found myself more at peace than I had anticipated. The preparation was complete, the strategy was sound, the contingencies were in place. All that remained was execution. I sent one final message to Susan. "Lawrence Bennett called, concerned about Zenith situation. Will join board meeting remotely from Singapore. Prepare briefing document on his voting history and positions on key issues. We may have an unexpected Allie." Then I closed my laptop, silenced my phone, and prepared for the evening ritual that had sustained me through countless professional challenges: a hot bath, a good book, and an early night. Tomorrow would require all my focus, clarity, and courage. Tonight was for replenishment and centered calm. As I drifted toward sleep, my father's voice seemed to echo in my memory. "Business isn't about winning or losing, Elise. It's about creating value that endures beyond individual victories or setbacks. Tomorrow would test that philosophy. Tomorrow would determine whether Meridian could be realigned with its founding values or whether those values would need to find expression elsewhere. Tomorrow would transform not just my professional future, but the futures of everyone connected to Meridian Solutions. I was ready. Monday morning arrived with crystalline clarity, the spring sunshine casting long shadows as I walked toward Meridian's headquarters. I'd chosen my attire with deliberate care, a charcoal gray suit that conveyed authority without ostentation, accented by a single piece of meaningful jewelry. My father's watch, its weight on my wrist a constant reminder of his principles. The security guard at the reception desk did a double take as I approached. "Ms. Winters?" I thought, he began, confusion evident in his expression. "I have a board meeting," I explained calmly, offering my visitor badge request already filled. Out. They're expecting me. This wasn't technically true. They were expecting Aurora Ventures' representative, not realizing that person was me. But it served its purpose. The guard processed my badge with only mild hesitation, perhaps assuming my termination had been rescinded over the weekend. As I rode the elevator to the executive floor, I mentally reviewed the timeline Susan and I had established. The board meeting would begin at 10 a.m. with standard quarterly updates. The Aurora Ventures disclosure was scheduled for 10:45 a.m. My termination wasn't on the official agenda, but the Zenith contract status would be discussed during the business development update around 10:30 a.m. The timing couldn't have been more perfect if I had orchestrated it myself. The board would first hear about the company's largest ever contract, then about potential complications with that contract due to my termination, and finally discover my ownership stake, all within a 30-minute window that would leave no opportunity for Victor to regroup or develop counter-arguments. The elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, where Meridian's boardroom occupied the northeast corner with its panoramic views of the city. Through the glass walls, I could see board members already gathering. Victor stood near the head of the table, engaged in animated conversation with Diane Morgan, one of his strongest allies on the board. Neither had noticed my arrival yet. Jessica, the board secretary, looked up from her preparations as I approached. Her eyes widened momentarily before she composed herself. "Ms. Winters," she greeted me professionally. "How can I help you?" "I'm here for the Aurora Ventures disclosure," I explained quietly. "As the primary stakeholder." Understanding dawned in her eyes, followed quickly by the professional discretion that made her excellent at her job. Without betraying any reaction beyond a slight nod, she consulted her tablet. "The disclosure is scheduled for 10:45. Would you prefer to wait in the anteroom until then?" "That would be perfect, thank you." As Jessica led me to the small meeting room adjacent to the boardroom, Victor finally noticed my presence. His conversation with Diane halted mid-sentence, his expression cycling rapidly through surprise, confusion, and alarm, before settling into forced neutrality. He excused himself from Diane and moved as if to intercept me, but Jessica had already ushered me into the anteroom and closed the door. Through the glass, I saw Victor approach Jessica, his body language demanding explanation. She responded with professional calm, gesturing toward her tablet as if referring to official documentation. Victor's expression darkened further, and he glanced toward the anteroom with unmistakable apprehension before returning to the boardroom. Perfect. The first seed of uncertainty had been planted. The anteroom offered a partial view of the boardroom, through privacy glass, enough to observe the meeting without being clearly visible to those inside. I settled into a chair positioned to maximize this advantage, taking a moment to center myself before the confrontation ahead. At precisely 10 a.m., the board meeting was called to order. James Harrison, the board chair, welcomed everyone and turned the floor over to Lawrence Bennett, who joined via video conference from Singapore despite the early hour there. Lawrence appeared composed but serious as he delivered his standard CEO Overview. From my vantage point, I could observe Victor's demeanor as the meeting progressed. He seemed distracted. His usual commanding presence diminished by frequent glances toward the anteroom and whispered conversations with Diane. The knowledge that I was nearby and somehow connected to Aurora Ventures had clearly destabilized him. At 10:25 a.m., the business development update began. Victor took the floor, highlighting the Zenith contract as Meridian's most significant achievement of the quarter. He spoke confidently about implementation plans, strategic implications, and revenue projections. What he notably omitted was any mention of who had secured the contract or the recent leadership changes affecting the account. Lawrence interrupted. From the video screen, his voice cutting clearly through the boardroom. Victor, before we continue, I believe we should address the management changes affecting the Zenith relationship. I understand Elise Winters, who developed and secured this contract, has been terminated from her position. Can you explain the rationale and timing of this decision? The boardroom fell silent. Victor's expression tightened momentarily before he regained his composure. Yes, following standard protocol for large account transitions, we've implemented our specialized implementation team structure. Elise's strengths in business development are being redirected toward new acquisition targets, while Aidan Collins leads the Zenith implementation with his technical expertise. Lawrence's skepticism was evident even through the video feed. Was this transition discussed with Zenith beforehand? My understanding is that Richard Dawson has requested an urgent meeting to discuss this change. Victor shifted uncomfortably. Zenith's meeting request is standard procedure for implementation planning. There's no indication of dissatisfaction with our transition approach. That contradicts my information, Lawrence replied coolly. I spoke directly with Richard yesterday. He expressed serious concerns about proceeding without Elise's involvement, and specifically referenced the 14-day review period in the contract. Board members exchanged alarmed glances. The Zenith contract represented not just significant revenue, but a strategic entry into a new market sector. Its potential loss would affect quarterly projections, shareholder confidence, and Meridian's competitive positioning. James Harrison, the board chair, leaned forward with evident concern. Victor, if the Zenith contract is at risk, the board needs to understand why. Was there consultation with Lawrence or the board before this personnel decision was made? The decision fell within my operational authority as COO, Victor responded, his tone growing defensive. Personnel transitions are standard after contract signing. No one could have anticipated Zenith would react negatively to normal account management protocols. Sofia Rodriguez, the attorney on the board, spoke for the first time. If the client's relationship with Elise was a material factor in securing the contract, removing her immediately after signing could potentially be construed as a bait-and-switch tactic. That carries legal and reputational risks we should have been consulted about. The conversation was developing exactly as I had hoped, exposing the flawed decision-making process without my direct involvement. Victor was being forced to defend, an increasingly indefensible position before I ever entered the room. At precisely 10:45 a.m., Jessica entered the boardroom and approached James Harrison, whispering briefly in his ear. He nodded and addressed the board. We'll return to the Zenith situation momentarily. It's time for our scheduled disclosure regarding Aurora Ventures' ownership stake. He turned to Jessica. Please show in Aurora's representative. This was my moment. I took a deep breath, straightened my posture, and walked deliberately into the boardroom. The reaction was immediate and profound. Victor's face drained of color. Diane Morgan's mouth actually fell open. The other board members displayed varying degrees of surprise, confusion, and sudden understanding. Good morning, I said calmly, taking the empty seat reserved for Aurora's representative. For those who may be confused, I am Elise Winters, primary stakeholder of Aurora Ventures. and holder of a 17% ownership interest in Meridian Solutions. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of silence that marks a fundamental shift in reality for everyone present. James Harrison recovered first, clearing his throat before speaking. Ms. Winters, this is unexpected. Our understanding was that Thomas Blackwell represented Aurora's interests. Mr. Blackwell served as Aurora's proxy representative, I confirmed. The original investment agreement specified that Aurora's primary stakeholder would remain anonymous for a 5-year term, with full disclosure scheduled for today's meeting. That stakeholder is me. Victor found his voice, though it carried a strain I'd never heard before. This is highly irregular. There are protocols for board attendance, procedures for a major shareholder to attend a quarterly board meeting, I interrupted smoothly. I believe those protocols have been followed precisely. Jessica can confirm that all necessary documentation was filed with the corporate secretary last week, as required. Jessica nodded her confirmation when all eyes turned to her. More importantly, I continued, today's meeting includes several agenda items of material interest to shareholders, particularly the status of the Zenith contract and the management decisions affecting it. Lawrence's voice came through the video feed, a note of dawning comprehension in his tone. So when we spoke yesterday about Zenith's concerns, I was providing you with accurate information as both a recently terminated employee and a significant shareholder. I completed his thought. Both perspectives are relevant to today's discussion. Daniel Kwan, the retired professor who typically remained quiet during board discussions, leaned forward with evident interest. Ms. Winters, while this disclosure is certainly surprising, I'm more concerned with the underlying business issue. If Zenith's contractual commitment is contingent on your involvement, how do you suggest we proceed? This was exactly the opening. I needed a direct invitation to address the business problem rather than the personal conflict. I opened my tablet and shared a document to the room's display system. I've prepared an analysis of the situation with recommended actions, I began, displaying a strategic framework rather than a list of grievances. The Zenith relationship can be salvaged, but it requires immediate corrective action. For the next 15 minutes, I presented a comprehensive overview of the Zenith situation, the broader pattern of governance issues it revealed, and a 3-phase plan for organizational realignment. My presentation remained focused on Meridian's health rather than Victor's misconduct, though the evidence inevitably illuminated the latter through objective business metrics. I concluded with the core recommendation. Meridian needs to re-establish its commitment to merit-based leadership, transparent decision-making, and client-centric account management. Practically speaking, that means 3 immediate actions: reinstating key personnel connected to the Zenith account, implementing governance protocols that prevent unilateral decisions affecting major client relationships, and restructuring the executive leadership to restore accountability. As I finished, the room remained silent for several moments, board members processing the implications of what I'd presented. Victor sat rigid in his chair, his expression a mixture of anger and calculation as he undoubtedly assessed his options for countering my influence. James Harrison broke the silence. This is a substantial amount of information to process. Victor, would you like to respond to Ms. Winters' assessment and recommendations? Victor straightened, summoning his considerable skills in corporate politics. I think we need to separate several issues that are being deliberately conflated here. First, Ms. Winters' unexpected ownership stake, which raises serious questions about conflicts of interest during her employment. Second, the Zenith contract transition, which follows established company protocols. And third, these vague allegations about governance that appear motivated by personal grievance rather than shareholder concern. His attempt to reframe the discussion might have gained traction if not for Lawrence's intervention from the video screen. With respect, Victor, Nothing about Ms. Winters's presentation struck me as vague. The metrics presented show clear patterns in resource allocation, talent management, and client retention that merit serious board attention. And her ownership stake, while surprising, was apparently disclosed through proper channels at the time of investment. The question before us isn't about Ms. Winter's motives, but about Meridian's current leadership effectiveness. Victor's jaw tightened visibly. Lawrence, with all due respect, you're viewing this situation from halfway around the world based on limited information. If we could table this discussion until your return. I'm quite capable of assessing the facts presented, Lawrence interrupted firmly. And those facts suggest we have an immediate issue with the Zenith contract that requires resolution before my return. The dynamic was shifting moment by moment. Victor's attempt to delay and deflect was faltering against the concrete business risk presented by the Zenith situation. Board members who might have dismissed my concerns in other circumstances were forced to confront the potential loss of a $15 million contract, a tangible consequence that transcended personalities or politics. Sophia Rodriguez, ever the pragmatic attorney, addressed me directly. Ms. Winters, setting aside the broader governance issues for a moment, what specifically would be required to secure Zenith's commitment to the contract? Based on my conversation with Richard Dawson, 3 things, I replied promptly. First, my direct involvement in the account management structure. Second, retention of the original implementation team I assembled rather than Victor's replacements. And third, written assurance that the implementation will follow the methodology we developed rather than being modified to fit standard templates. And you would be willing to return to Meridian in some capacity to facilitate this? She pressed. I would consider appropriate arrangements that serve both Zenith's needs and Meridian's long-term interests, I confirmed, intentionally leaving the specifics open for negotiation. James Harrison turned to Victor, his expression grave. Given the financial implications of potentially losing this contract, it seems prudent to consider Ms. Winter's assessment seriously. What is your perspective on her specific recommendations regarding the Zenith situation? Victor was trapped and knew it. Opposing my reinstatement now meant potentially sacrificing the Zenith contract, which would raise uncomfortable questions about his judgment in terminating me in the first place. Yet accepting my return meant undermining his authority and tacitly acknowledging his mistake. I believe we should, he began, then paused, visibly recalculating his approach. I'm open to adjustments in the implementation structure if the board feels they're necessary. However, I have serious concerns about setting precedents regarding client influence over our internal staffing decisions. It was a weak response, and everyone in the room recognized it. The momentum had shifted decisively. What had begun as Victor's unilateral decision to remove a perceived threat had transformed into a board-level examination of leadership effectiveness, with millions in revenue hanging in the balance. James Harrison surveyed the room, reading the shifting consensus. I propose we take a brief recess to consider next steps, 15 minutes, and then we'll reconvene to determine immediate actions regarding both the Zenith contract and the broader governance questions Ms. Winters has raised. As board members filed out for the break, Victor remained seated, staring at the presentation still displayed on the screen. The carefully constructed narrative of his leadership was unraveling before his eyes, and for once, he had no ready response. I gathered my materials unhurriedly, feeling neither triumph nor vindication, but rather a calm certainty that Meridian was taking its first steps back toward the company it was meant to be. The confrontation had been necessary not for personal redemption, but for organizational health, exactly as my father would have approached it. The real work of transformation was just beginning. The boardroom felt different when we reconvened 15 minutes later. The atmosphere had shifted from shocked confrontation to focused deliberation. Board members returned with notepads filled with hastily scribbled thoughts, expressions serious but engaged. This was no longer about my termination or Victor's authority. It had become about Meridian's future. James Harrison called the meeting back to order with newfound gravity. Before we continue, I'd like to establish some parameters for our discussion. We face three distinct but interconnected issues: the immediate Zenith contract situation, Ms. Winter's role at Meridian given both her termination and her significant ownership stake, and the broader governance questions raised by her presentation. Victor had used the break to regain his composure. His expression now calculated neutrality rather than defensive anger. He sat straighter, positioned papers before him with mathematical precision, and maintained unwavering eye contact with each speaker, all hallmarks of his controlled professional persona. "I suggest we address the most time-sensitive matter first," Lawrence said from the video screen, the early morning Singapore light creating a halo effect behind him. "The Zenith contract has significant immediate financial implications that require resolution before their Tuesday meeting." "Agreed." Sofia Rodriguez nodded. "The governance issues are crucial but can be addressed through proper committee work over the coming weeks. The Zenith situation demands immediate action." Victor seized this opening with practiced skill. "In the interest of Meridian stability, I'm prepared to modify the Zenith implementation team structure to include appropriate oversight of client relationships." He paused strategically before continuing. "Perhaps Ms. Winters could serve in an advisory capacity during the transition period, reporting through standard management channels to ensure operational consistency." It was a masterful attempt to appear reasonable while maintaining his authority, offering a superficial concession that would still leave him in control of the Zenith relationship and my involvement. Under normal circumstances, the board might have accepted this compromise as prudent middle ground. But these weren't normal circumstances. "I spoke with Richard Dawson during our break," Daniel Kwan said unexpectedly, his usually quiet voice carrying surprising authority. He confirmed that Zenith's commitment is explicitly tied to Ms. Winter's direct leadership of the implementation, not advisory oversight. He was quite specific about their expectations. All eyes turned to the professor emeritus with surprise. He adjusted his glasses before continuing. "I've served on 7 corporate boards over my career. When a $15 million contract hinges on specific personnel, creating unnecessary organizational layers between that person and the client demonstrates poor business judgment." Victor's carefully constructed facade cracked slightly. "You contacted a client directly during a board recess? That's highly irregular and potentially undermines our negotiating position." Daniel remained unperturbed. "As a board member, I have fiduciary responsibility to verify material facts affecting shareholder value." The call took 3 minutes and provided essential clarity. The dynamic was shifting again, with unexpected allies emerging. Daniel had been considered one of the board's more passive members, rarely challenging executive decisions directly. His intervention now carried particular weight precisely because of that historical restraint. Diane Morgan, who had initially seemed aligned with Victor, leaned forward with a new calculation evident in her expression. As a venture capitalist, her primary loyalty was to financial returns rather than personal alliances. "Victor, I appreciate your willingness to compromise, but it seems insufficient given the client's explicit expectations. Perhaps we should consider a more substantive reorganization of the Zenith team structure, one that gives Ms. Winters direct authority commensurate with her responsibility for the relationship." Victor recognized the shifting consensus but made one final attempt to maintain control. "I'm concerned about establishing problematic precedents. If we allow clients to dictate our internal reporting structures based on personal relationships rather than institutional capabilities, we undermine the very foundation of organizational stability." This might have been persuasive in another context, but Lawrence countered immediately from the video screen. "There's a difference between clients dictating our structure and us recognizing when specific expertise and relationships are essential components of what they're purchasing. Zenith clearly understood they were contracting for Elise's approach and oversight, not just Meridian's brand name. James Harrison, sensing the emerged consensus, moved toward resolution. I propose the following. Ms. Winters is reinstated, effective immediately as Executive Vice President of Strategic Client Relations, with direct authority over the Zenith implementation and reporting structure. This addresses the immediate contract concern while establishing appropriate organizational standing. The title suggestion, Executive Vice President, rather than my previous director level, wasn't lost on anyone in the room. It represented not just reinstatement but promotion, positioning me at the same hierarchical level as Victor rather than subordinate to him. I support this proposal, Lawrence said immediately. It addresses the client need while strengthening our implementation capabilities. One by one, board members voiced their agreement. First Daniel, then Sophia, then Diane. Even Thomas Blackwell, who had served as Aurora's proxy and remained mostly silent throughout the meeting, added his support. Only Victor remained opposed, though he recognized the futility of further objection. For the record, he said stiffly, I believe this sets a concerning precedent for how we manage client relationships and organizational structure. However, I acknowledge the board's authority in this matter. Ms. Winters, James turned to me. Would this arrangement be acceptable to you, and do you believe it would satisfy Zenith's concerns? I considered the proposal carefully, aware that my response would set the tone for what followed. This wasn't about personal vindication, but organizational effectiveness. The title and authority were important not for ego, but for ability to implement necessary changes. The proposed role would enable me to deliver what Zenith expects, I confirmed. However, to be fully effective, I would need 3 specific parameters: direct oversight of implementation methodologies, authority to maintain the original team composition I assembled, and a seat on the executive committee to ensure strategic alignment. These weren't arbitrary demands but practical requirements for success. Without them, Victor could still undermine the implementation through resource allocation, team reassignments, or methodological interference. The executive committee seat would ensure visibility into broader company strategy affecting the Zenith relationship. James looked to Lawrence, who nodded his approval. Those parameters seem reasonable given the scope of responsibility and the contract importance. Does the board agree to include them in the formal resolution? The agreement was unanimous, even Victor recognizing that further objection would only highlight his isolation. With the immediate Zenith issue resolved, James Harrison turned to the second matter. Regarding Ms. Winters' ownership stake and its implications, I propose we establish a special governance committee to review our policies around insider investment, information disclosure, and potential conflicts. This committee should provide recommendations at our next meeting. This was a reasonable approach that acknowledged the unusual situation without unnecessarily problematizing my investment. Aurora's stake had been properly disclosed from the beginning, with the identity of the primary stakeholder protected through standard privacy provisions. There were no regulatory concerns, only governance considerations about future situations. I support that approach, I said, and would recuse myself from any discussions where my dual role creates potential conflicts of interest. Sophia Rodriguez, with her legal background, seemed satisfied with this solution. A comprehensive governance review makes sense. We should also engage outside counsel to ensure our policies meet current best practices for situations involving significant insider investment. With the first 2 issues addressed, James turned to the most challenging aspect, the broader governance questions raised by my presentation. Ms. Winters has presented concerning data regarding our decision-making processes, resource allocation, talent management, and client retention under current leadership. These merit serious consideration beyond today's meeting. I suggest we Establish a dedicated session within the next 2 weeks to address these matters comprehensively. Victor saw his opening and took it immediately. I welcome thorough examination of our operational effectiveness. A complete review will also provide context around decisions that may appear problematic when viewed selectively. I'm confident the board will find our overall trajectory remains strong despite inevitable individual disagreements about specific approaches. It was a strategic retreat, acknowledging the need for review while positioning himself as transparent and accountable. By promising context and referring to selective viewing, he was already constructing his defense. What he failed to recognize was how this approach actually validated my central criticism: his tendency to prioritize perception management over substantive leadership. Rather than addressing the specific patterns identified in my presentation, he immediately focused on how to frame those patterns favorably. Lawrence noticed this too. I look forward to that comprehensive discussion. In preparation, I'd like our analysis team to independently verify the metrics presented today and provide additional trend data across departments. We should ensure our review is based on complete information rather than narrative framing. Victor's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Independent verification would make it harder to obscure the patterns through selective context. That seems prudent, James agreed. Are there any other immediate actions required before we conclude today's extended session? I had remained measured throughout the discussion, focusing on organizational needs rather than personal vindication. But one final matter required addressing, not for my benefit, but for the precedent it would establish. There is one additional consideration, I said carefully. My termination involved retroactive modification of the commission structure for the Zenith contract, reducing compensation significantly below what was originally specified. If we're committed to merit-based leadership and accountability, addressing this irregularity seems important for both precedent and organizational culture. This wasn't about the money itself, though the amount was substantial, but about establishing that contractual commitments to employees carried the same weight as those to external parties. Companies that selectively honor agreements create cultures of mistrust and self-protection rather than innovation and collaboration. Lawrence responded immediately. That's a valid point. Compensation agreements should be honored consistently. I propose we direct HR to restore the original commission structure as documented in Ms. Winter's employment agreement. Victor began to object, but stopped himself, recognizing that this battle was already lost. His attempt to financially penalize me while benefiting from my work had backfired completely, becoming instead further evidence of problematic leadership. As the meeting concluded, board members approached to welcome me in my new role, some with genuine warmth, others with carefully calibrated professional courtesy. Victor left immediately, avoiding direct interaction and already calling key allies on his phone as he exited. Lawrence remained on the video call after others had departed. Elise, if you have a moment? I nodded, taking a seat closer to the screen as the room emptied. That was quite a revelation, he said with a mixture of admiration and chagrin. I wish you had felt able to approach me directly about the situation with Victor before it reached this point. I considered it, I acknowledged honestly. But the pattern was systemic, Lawrence. It required board-level visibility and intervention, not just executive mediation. He nodded thoughtfully. Fair assessment. And now we face significant organizational realignment ahead of us. Victor won't accept the new reality easily. No, I agreed. He won't. But Meridian is bigger than any individual, including me. The company needed course correction, regardless of how it was initiated. Lawrence studied me with new appreciation. Your father would be proud, you know, not just of your business acumen, but of how you've handled this situation. Henry always believed that leadership was about institutional health, not personal advantage. The unexpected mention of my father and Lawrence's apparent knowledge of our relationship surprised me. You knew him? Lawrence smiled slightly. We served on an industry commission together years ago. When Aurora made its initial investment, he mentioned he had a personal connection to Meridian's future. I didn't realize then exactly what he meant, but it makes sense now. This revelation added unexpected dimension to my connection with Meridian, another thread in the complex tapestry my father had woven before his passing. His confidence in my ability to navigate this situation, even without his direct guidance, felt like a final gift. Thank you for sharing that, I said sincerely. It means a great deal. As we concluded our conversation and I finally left the boardroom, the enormity of the morning's events began to register. In the span of 3 hours, I had transformed from terminated employee to executive vice president with board-recognized authority. The pattern of invisibility and appropriation that had defined my Meridian experience had been irrevocably broken. But this wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. The real work lay ahead, rebuilding the Zenith relationship, restructuring implementation methodologies, addressing the governance issues that had allowed Victor's leadership approach to flourish, and ultimately helping Meridian reclaim its original vision of innovation and merit-based advancement. As I stepped into the elevator, my phone buzzed with a message from Richard Dawson at Zenith. Heard rumors of leadership changes at Meridian. Any updates before tomorrow's meeting? I smiled as I typed my response. Significant positive developments. I'll be leading the implementation personally as Executive Vice President of Strategic Client Relations. Looking forward to discussing details tomorrow. His reply came almost instantly. Excellent news. Meeting changed from evaluation to planning. Team is relieved. The elevator doors opened onto the main lobby, where I encountered Natalie, the junior account manager Victor had assigned to take over my client relationships. Her expression registered shock at seeing me. Elise, we heard there was a board meeting, but no one knew you'd be here. Is everything okay? Better than okay, I assured her with genuine warmth. There have been some organizational changes. I'll be returning to lead the Zenith implementation, and I'd like you on the team if you're interested. Your client communication skills would be valuable. Her face brightened instantly. Really? I'd love that opportunity. The past few days have been complicated. I can imagine, I said understandingly. Things will stabilize soon. We'll have a team meeting tomorrow afternoon to realign everyone. As I continued through the lobby, other colleagues noticed my presence, whispering among themselves with visible confusion and curiosity. The news would spread rapidly, as it always did at Meridian. By tomorrow, everyone would know about my return and promotion, and about the board's implicit rebuke of Victor's leadership. Outside, the spring air felt extraordinarily fresh, the sunshine more vivid than it had seemed just hours earlier. The Meridian building still dominated the skyline from this vantage point. But my perspective had fundamentally shifted. It was no longer a structure that contained and sometimes constrained my professional identity, but an institution I now had genuine power to shape and improve. My phone buzzed again. Susan this time. News traveling fast. Already received 7 messages from Meridian employees. How should I respond? Tell them I'm back, I replied simply. And we're just getting started. The next morning, I arrived at Meridian's headquarters an hour before standard business hours. The building was quiet, with only security personnel and early arriving executives present. This deliberate timing gave me space to prepare for the day's critical meetings, without navigating the inevitable questions and congratulations from colleagues still processing yesterday's dramatic developments. My new office, formerly occupied by the outgoing VP of Operations who had aligned with Victor's inner circle, offered a commanding view of the city skyline. The space was 3 times larger than my previous work area, with an adjoining conference room and a dedicated space. For my executive assistant, the nameplate hadn't been changed yet. It would take time for the physical environment to catch up with the organizational reality. Susan arrived minutes after I did, carrying 2 coffee cups and a portfolio bulging with documents. Her efficiency remained a constant in this sea of change. "Your schedule is confirmed," she announced, setting my coffee on the desk. Zenith at 9 a.m., implementation team at 11:30, executive committee introduction at 1, and Lawrence has requested a private call at 4:30 to discuss transition priorities. "Thank you," I said, taking a grateful sip of the perfectly prepared coffee. "What's the word from the front lines?" Susan's expression was measured but couldn't quite contain her satisfaction. "Chaotic, but largely positive. Victor called an emergency leadership meeting last night after the board session, positioned the changes as a strategic realignment, with no mention of the confrontation. His allies are circling wagons, but most mid-level managers seem cautiously optimistic about your return." "And the Zenith team?" "Relieved," she confirmed. Aiden tried to conduct an implementation planning session yesterday afternoon, but the team essentially stonewalled him, citing methodology questions that needed clarification. "They were already betting on your return based on building rumors." I nodded, considering the complexity of the transition ahead. My objective wasn't to create parallel power structures or foster division, but to realign Meridian with its foundational values. That meant building bridges where possible, even with those who had initially aligned with Victor's approach. "What about Victor himself?" I asked, knowing his reaction would shape much of the near-term dynamics. Susan's expression turned more serious. "He cleared his calendar except for essential client meetings. His assistant mentioned a lunch scheduled with Diane Morgan today, presumably building board support for the governance review." This was expected. Victor was too skilled in organizational politics to surrender influence without a strategic counter-campaign. The governance committee, James had proposed, would become his battleground for limiting the scope of potential leadership changes. "Let's proceed with absolute professionalism," I instructed. "No triumphalism, no references to winning or vindication. This isn't about personalities, but about organizational health. Every communication and meeting should reflect that perspective." Susan nodded her approval. "I've prepared briefing documents for each of today's meetings with that exact approach. The emphasis throughout is on client service, implementation excellence, and team alignment." I reviewed the material she had prepared, impressed as always by her strategic thinking. The Zenith briefing focused entirely on implementation methodology and timeline commitments, with no mention of the internal drama that had necessitated my return. The team meeting agenda emphasized continuity and shared purpose rather than leadership changes. Even the executive committee introduction was framed around collaborative opportunity rather than authority shifts. "This is perfect," I confirmed, handing the portfolios back. "Let's make today about moving forward, not looking backward." As 9 o'clock approached, I walked to the main conference room where the Zenith meeting would be held. Richard Dawson had arrived early with his implementation team, their expressions noticeably brightening when I entered the room. "Elise," Richard greeted me warmly, standing to shake my hand. "Congratulations on your promotion. A well-deserved recognition of your value to Meridian." "Thank you, Richard. I appreciate your patience during our organizational transition. Today is about ensuring your confidence in our implementation approach and timeline." For the next 2 hours, we conducted a substantive working session focused entirely on Zenith's needs. I reaffirmed the core methodologies we had developed together, introduced the implementation team members with emphasis on their specific expertise, and established clear accountability measures for tracking progress against milestones. Richard was direct as the meeting concluded. "This is exactly why we chose Meridian, Elise. The clarity of approach, the understanding of our objectives beyond technical specifications, the alignment with our organizational values. I'm glad the uncertainty of recent days has been resolved favorably. His diplomatic phrasing acknowledged the situation without dwelling on it, a professional courtesy that allowed both organizations to move forward without lingering on the conflict. "We value Zenith's partnership," I responded with equal professionalism. "The implementation will receive my direct oversight throughout, with weekly progress reviews and transparent escalation protocols for any concerns." As the Zenith team departed, I noticed Victor observing from the adjacent hallway, his expression carefully neutral. Our eyes met briefly before he nodded a minimal acknowledgement and continued toward his office. The interaction lasted only seconds but communicated volumes. He recognized the changed power dynamic, but wasn't prepared to concede the larger institutional battle. The implementation team meeting at 11:30 carried different emotional weight. These were colleagues who had worked closely with me for years, who had witnessed the pattern of credit appropriation, who had continued building our methodologies even as leadership recognition flowed elsewhere. Their reaction to my return was more personal, more visibly relieved. "Before we begin," I said as they settled around the conference table, "I want to acknowledge the professionalism you've maintained throughout this transition. Your commitment to client excellence despite organizational uncertainty demonstrates exactly why Zenith values our partnership." Marcus Chen, our lead solutions architect, spoke for the group. "We're just glad to have clarity again. The past few days were confusing." "I understand," I acknowledged. "But today we refocus entirely on implementation excellence. Zenith deserves our best work regardless of internal dynamics." We spent the next hour reviewing the implementation timeline, assigning clear responsibilities, and establishing communication protocols. I was careful to emphasize continuity where appropriate while introducing refinements that would improve execution. By session's end, the team's relief had transformed into focused enthusiasm. Exactly the mindset required for successful delivery. The executive committee introduction at 1 p.m. presented more complex dynamics. Victor would be present as COO, along with the 7 other executives who comprised Meridian's senior leadership. Some were his close allies, others more neutral. In the ongoing power realignment, all would be assessing how this unexpected change would affect their own positions and initiatives. I arrived precisely on time, neither eager nor hesitant, and took the open seat designated for my new role. Victor sat directly across from me, flanked by his strongest supporters, the VP of Sales and the Chief Marketing Officer, both of whom owed their positions to his advocacy. Lawrence joined via video conference from Singapore, his presence providing subtle counterbalance to Victor's influence. "Welcome, everyone," Lawrence began. "Today we formally introduce Elise Winters in her new capacity as Executive Vice President of Strategic Client Relations. As you know, Elise secured our groundbreaking contract with Zenith Technologies and will now lead its implementation with direct oversight of our methodology and team structure." He paused, allowing the formal acknowledgement to register before continuing. "This new executive role reflects our commitment to client-centered innovation and account governance. Elise will join the executive committee effective immediately, participating in all strategic planning and resource allocation discussions." Victor maintained perfect composure, offering a professionally cordial nod when Lawrence mentioned my name. His performance was flawless, betraying neither resentment nor artificial enthusiasm, just appropriate collegial respect. Anyone who hadn't witnessed yesterday's confrontation would never suspect the seismic shift in authority taking place. "Thank you, Lawrence," I responded with equal professionalism. "I look forward to collaborating with everyone to strengthen Meridian's client relationships and implementation methodologies. My focus will be ensuring our strategic direction aligns with client success metrics while maximizing long-term partnership value." The neutrality of my language was deliberate, emphasizing institutional effectiveness rather than personal authority. This wasn't about displacing Victor or claiming territory, but about refocusing organizational priorities on client outcomes rather than internal politics. For the next hour, we reviewed the standard executive committee agenda items: quarterly, projections, major initiatives, resource allocation questions. I participated where appropriate, offering insight on client implications without attempting to dominate discussion or assert authority beyond my defined role. Victor similarly maintained professional engagement, neither yielding ground unnecessarily nor creating overt conflict. The tension remained palpable beneath the surface courtesy, but both of us recognized that open hostility would only damage our respective positions. As the meeting concluded, Lawrence asked us both to remain on the call after others had departed. Once we were alone, his expression shifted to one of frank assessment. "That was professionally handled by both of you," he acknowledged. "But sustainable leadership requires more than surface courtesy. Victor, Elise, the board has made its determination on immediate matters, but Meridian's long-term success depends on genuine alignment between its senior executives." Victor nodded slightly. "I understand the board's decision and will support organizational stability during this transition. My concerns about governance precedent remain, but those will be addressed through appropriate channels rather than operational resistance." His careful wording maintained his objection to the process while signaling willingness to work within the new structure, at least temporarily. It was a strategic retreat, not a surrender. "I appreciate that approach," I responded. "My focus remains on client outcomes and implementation excellence. The organizational questions will resolve through proper governance review, as James outlined." Lawrence studied us both with the weary wisdom of a CEO who had navigated countless executive conflicts. "The board meets again in 3 weeks to review the governance committee's initial findings. I suggest you both use that time to demonstrate how effectively you can collaborate despite personal differences. Their assessment of longer-term leadership structure will inevitably be influenced by operational results during this period." This was both advice and warning. The current arrangement, with Victor and me as parallel authorities, was inherently unstable. The next board meeting would likely determine a more definitive leadership structure based on our relative effectiveness during the interim period. After concluding the call with Lawrence, Victor and I found ourselves alone in the conference. The artificial courtesy of the executive meeting gave way to more direct acknowledgement of our situation. "Congratulations on your tactical victory," Victor said, his tone precise rather than bitter. "It was well executed." "It wasn't a tactic, Victor. It was a necessary correction after years of systematic credit appropriation and merit suppression." I kept my voice equally measured, stating facts rather than expressing grievance. He considered this before responding. "We have fundamentally different perspectives on leadership and organizational structure. I believe in institutional continuity and hierarchical clarity. You prioritize individual recognition and merit visibility. Both approaches have validity in different contexts." This was classic Victor, reformulating conflict as philosophical difference rather than behavioral issue. It allowed him to position his actions as principled leadership rather than self-serving advancement. "The difference," I countered calmly, "is that my approach doesn't require others to become invisible for me to succeed. Merit-based recognition creates multiplicative value, not zero-sum competition." For a moment, genuine curiosity seemed to replace calculation in his expression. "You truly believe organizational success comes from maximizing individual visibility rather than unified institutional presence?" "I believe sustainable excellence requires both," I clarified. "Strong, institutional identity built on properly acknowledged individual contributions. What's unsustainable is an approach that systemically divorces recognition from contribution. It eventually drives away your most valuable talent." Victor nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of the perspective. The next 3 weeks will demonstrate which approach better serves Meridian's objectives. I look forward to the empirical results. As he rose to leave, he paused briefly. One question, if you're willing to answer. How long have you been planning this? The Aurora revelation timing with your termination seems too perfect to be coincidental. I didn't plan to be terminated the week before the scheduled disclosure, I replied honestly. But I did ensure I had positional leverage before accepting continued credit appropriation. My father taught me to create options from positions of strength, not to react from positions of weakness. Something shifted in Victor's expression. At the mention of my father, a flicker of revised calculation. Henry Winters, he said quietly. I should have made the connection earlier. His approach to corporate governance was similarly unconventional. With that cryptic comment, he departed, leaving me to wonder exactly what history might exist between Victor and my father, and how that might influence the organizational dynamics ahead. The remainder of the day unfolded with methodical purpose. I met with key team members, established preliminary communication protocols for my new role, and began reviewing the implementation documentation for the Zenith project. By late afternoon, the initial shock of my return had given way to pragmatic adaptation throughout the organization. People adjusted to new realities with remarkable speed when those realities were presented as established fact rather than ongoing negotiation. My final meeting of the day was the private call with Lawrence at 4:30. As we connected, I noticed he had moved from his hotel room to what appeared to be a private meeting space, suggesting he wanted additional confidentiality for our conversation. Elise, he began without preamble, you've handled today's transition admirably. The feedback from the Zenith meeting and implementation team session has been universally positive. Thank you, I acknowledged. My priority is stabilizing client relationships and team dynamics before addressing broader organizational questions. Lawrence nodded approvingly. That's the right approach, but we need to discuss the longer-term strategy for Meridian's leadership structure. The current arrangement with parallel authority between you and Victor is functionally unsustainable. I recognize that, I agreed. The governance committee will need to recommend more definitive structure at the next board meeting. Precisely, Lawrence confirmed. And that recommendation will be substantially influenced by demonstrated effectiveness during these 3 weeks. Victor understands this dynamic as well as you do, perhaps better, given his experience in corporate politics. He's already working to shore up board support through individual outreach to directors. This wasn't surprising. Victor's strength had always been relationship cultivation with those in positions of influence. What remained unclear was Lawrence's own position in this evolving dynamic. What outcome do you believe best serves Meridian? I asked directly, watching his reaction carefully. Lawrence considered the question with genuine thoughtfulness. Meridian needs leadership that balances institutional stability with innovation recognition. Victor's approach emphasized the former at the expense of the latter. Your history suggests you value the latter, but the question remains whether you can equally maintain the former. It was a fair assessment, acknowledging Victor's systematic failures while questioning whether my alternative would fully address organizational needs. My father built 3 successful companies on the principle that institutional strength flows from appropriately recognized individual contribution, I said. I believe Meridian can reclaim that balance with proper leadership focus. Lawrence's expression showed genuine interest. I knew your father primarily through industry associations, rather than direct business partnership. His reputation for building organizations where talent flourished while maintaining strong institutional identity was remarkable. If you've inherited that capability, Meridian would benefit tremendously. Our conversation continued for another 30 minutes, exploring specific approaches to Meridian's current challenges and potential leadership structures that might emerge from the governance review. By its conclusion, I had a clearer understanding. of Lawrence's priorities, and of his willingness to support substantial leadership changes if they demonstrated improved organizational outcomes. As I finally left the office that evening, the Meridian building stood illuminated against the darkening sky, a physical manifestation of the institution that had simultaneously exploited and shaped my professional identity for 7 years. Yesterday, I had viewed it with detached strategic calculation. Today, having reclaimed my rightful position within its structure, I felt renewed connection to its potential. The transformation had begun, not just of my role, but of Meridian's fundamental approach to talent, credit, and leadership. Victor's resistance would continue, the governance battle remained ahead, and sustainable change would require persistent effort beyond initial victories. But something essential had shifted. A pattern broken, a possibility created, a path opened toward the organization Meridian was meant to be. The $15 million contract that had triggered my termination had instead become the catalyst for institutional renewal. As I drove home through the spring evening, my father's words echoed in my memory. True leadership isn't measured by personal advancement, but by institutional transformation. Create environments where merit is visible, contribution is valued, and excellence multiplies rather than transfers. That's the legacy worth building. The journey ahead would test that philosophy in ways neither of us had anticipated, but the first steps toward transformation had been taken, and there would be no returning to the patterns of the past. The illusion of normalcy lasted precisely 8 days. For that brief period, Meridian operated with a veneer of stability, despite the seismic leadership shifts beneath the surface. The Zenith implementation launched successfully under my direct oversight. Team morale improved as merit recognition replaced political alignment in daily operations. Even Victor maintained professional courtesy in our unavoidable interactions, focusing on operational continuity rather than authority challenges. Then came the Helix proposal. I was reviewing implementation metrics with the Zenith team when Susan appeared at the conference room door, her expression conveying urgency despite her professional composure. "Excuse me, Elise," she said calmly. "There's a situation requiring your immediate attention." I wrapped up the meeting efficiently before following Susan to my office, where she closed the door before speaking. "Richard Dawson just called," she began without preamble. "Zenith received an unsolicited proposal from Helix Group this morning, offering implementation services that appear remarkably similar to our approach. The proposal specifically mentions methodologies identical to those you developed." My mind processed the implications immediately. The Helix proposal I had reviewed before my reinstatement, the contingency plan developed during my termination, had somehow been activated despite my explicit instruction to hold it in reserve. "Has Richard shared the proposal?" I asked, maintaining outward calm despite the internal alarm. Susan handed me a tablet displaying the document. "He sent it immediately, concerned about potential confidentiality breaches. The similarities to our methodology are unmistakable." I reviewed the proposal carefully, confirming my initial assessment. This was indeed the revised approach I had helped Helix develop, though with subtle modifications that obscured its direct connection to me. The implementation timeline, resource allocation model, and integration architecture all reflected the specialized approach I had designed for Zenith's unique needs. "Who at Helix submitted this?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "Carson Williams personally," Susan confirmed. "He's requesting a meeting with Zenith's leadership team tomorrow morning." This development carried layers of complication. While I had explicitly instructed Susan to hold the Helix contingency in reserve following my reinstatement, I had never formally withdrawn from the arrangement. From Carson's perspective, the opportunity with Zenith remained viable, particularly if someone had suggested I might not maintain my position at Meridian long term. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Someone had deliberately activated this competitive threat precisely when it would create maximum disruption to my leadership stabilization efforts. Someone who understood that a perceived connection between me and a competitor's proposal would raise serious questions about my loyalty to Meridian despite my reinstatement. Someone like Victor. Call Carson immediately, I instructed Susan. Request that he withdraw the proposal pending further discussion. Then schedule an urgent meeting with Richard to address his concerns directly. While Susan made the calls, I considered the strategic implications. If Victor had indeed orchestrated this situation, perhaps through connections at Helix or through monitoring my activities during termination, his objective was clear. Create doubt about my commitment to Meridian despite my reinstatement, positioning me as a potential corporate saboteur who had developed competitive alternatives while negotiating my return. The governance committee meeting was just 9 days away. This manufactured crisis could significantly influence their assessment of leadership stability under the current arrangement. Carson Williams answered my call personally, his tone carefully neutral. Elise, I was just about to reach out to you. There seems to be some confusion about our Zenith opportunity. The confusion, I replied with equal care, is why Helix submitted a proposal after I explicitly communicated that the contingency plan should be held in reserve. A pause followed before Carson responded. That contradicts my understanding of our arrangement. I received confirmation 3 days ago that we should proceed with the Zenith outreach as planned. Confirmation from whom? I asked directly. Another hesitation. From a representative who identified themselves as authorized to speak on your behalf regarding our arrangement. Given the sensitivity of your dual role transitioning between organizations, the approach seemed appropriate. This confirmed my suspicion. Someone had impersonated my authorization, likely using information gathered during my termination period when the Helix contingency was being developed. The question was whether Carson was an unwitting participant or an active collaborator in the deception. Carson, I never authorized proceeding with the Zenith proposal after my reinstatement at Meridian. That authorization was falsified by someone attempting to create conflict between me and my current employer. His response was measured. That's a concerning allegation, Elise. If accurate, it puts Helix in an extremely uncomfortable position with both you and Zenith. Precisely why I'm requesting an immediate withdrawal of the proposal pending clarification of these circumstances, I said firmly. Continuing this approach benefits neither Helix's reputation nor Zenith's implementation needs. Carson agreed to withdraw the proposal pending further discussion, though his careful phrasing suggested lingering uncertainty about the situation. The damage control with Zenith would be more complicated. Richard Dawson arrived at Meridian an hour later, his expression grave as he entered my office. Our relationship had always been built on transparency and mutual respect, qualities now threatened by the appearance of competing loyalties. Richard, thank you for bringing this directly to my attention, I began, acknowledging the concern immediately. The Helix proposal was not authorized by me despite containing methodologies I developed. His expression remained guarded. Elise, our decision to proceed with Meridian was based entirely on your direct involvement and approach. Finding that same approach suddenly available through competitors raises fundamental questions about confidentiality and commitment. I understand completely, I acknowledged. During my brief termination period, I explored contingency options to ensure Zenith would receive the implementation approach we had developed together, regardless of my professional situation. Once reinstated, I explicitly halted those explorations. Someone has deliberately misrepresented my continued involvement to create precisely this confusion. Richard studied me carefully, years of executive experience making him attuned to organizational politics. You believe this was intentionally orchestrated to undermine your position at Meridian. It wasn't a question, but a conclusion. One that demonstrated his understanding of corporate power dynamics. The timing and execution suggest deliberate intention, I confirmed without directly naming Victor. Carson Williams has agreed to withdraw the proposal pending clarification of these circumstances. My commitment remains exclusively to Meridian and to your implementation success. Richard nodded slowly. I believe your explanation, Elise. Our working relationship has always been characterized by transparency. However, this situation necessitates additional assurance regarding Meridian's internal stability and your sustained authority over our implementation. This was both reasonable and strategically necessary. The Helix situation had introduced uncertainty that required concrete remediation, not just verbal reassurance. I propose an enhanced governance structure for the Zenith implementation, I suggested. Direct oversight from Lawrence Bennett and quarterly board-level reviews of implementation progress against committed milestones. This would provide institutional guarantees beyond individual authority. Richard considered this approach. That would address our immediate concerns about implementation continuity. I'll communicate this resolution to our executive team, contingent on formal confirmation from Meridian's CEO. After Richard departed, I immediately briefed Lawrence via secure video conference, explaining both the Helix situation and my assessment of its likely orchestration. His expression grew increasingly grave as the implications became clear. This is extraordinary, he said when I finished. Using a competitor to manufacture a loyalty crisis immediately before the governance review. If Victor is indeed behind this, it demonstrates concerning ethical boundaries. The circumstantial evidence is compelling, I replied carefully, though proving direct involvement will be challenging. What matters now is containing the potential damage to the Zenith relationship and addressing the leadership implications before the governance committee meeting. Lawrence agreed. I'll provide formal assurance to Richard regarding the enhanced governance structure you proposed. As for the broader implications, this situation actually strengthens the case for more definitive leadership realignment. Manufacturing competitive threats for internal political advantage demonstrates exactly the cultural problems you identified in your initial presentation. While Lawrence handled the client communication, I turned my attention to the internal dimension of this orchestrated crisis. If Victor had indeed engineered this situation, he would already be positioning it with key stakeholders, shaping the narrative before I could respond. Proactive transparency was essential. I scheduled a meeting with James Harrison, the board chair who would be leading the governance committee review. Unlike reactive defense that would appear suspiciously hurried, a proactive briefing would demonstrate confidence and institutional prioritization over personal advantage. James agreed to meet that evening at a restaurant away from Meridian's offices, providing appropriate discretion for a sensitive leadership discussion. At 68, with decades of corporate governance experience, he brought measured perspective to volatile situations. Thank you for making time on short notice, I began after we had ordered. I wanted to brief you directly on a situation affecting both the Zenith implementation and the upcoming governance review. I outlined the Helix proposal situation concisely, presenting factual events without attributing motivation or making accusations against Victor. James listened attentively, occasionally asking clarifying questions that revealed his sophisticated understanding of corporate maneuvers. This is troubling on multiple levels, he said when I concluded. Beyond the immediate client concern, it suggests internal dynamics incompatible with stable leadership structure. My priority remains Meridian's institutional health, I emphasized. The enhanced governance structure I've proposed for Zenith addresses their immediate concerns while reinforcing board oversight of critical implementations. James nodded approvingly. That's the right approach, institutional solutions rather than personality-driven responses. Have you discussed this directly with Victor? The question was carefully neutral, testing whether I had maintained professional protocols despite the apparent sabotage attempt. Not yet, I acknowledged. Given the sensitivity of potential accusations without definitive evidence, I prioritized client stabilization and appropriate board visibility before engaging in what could become an unproductive confrontation. Wise restraint, James observed. Though at some point, direct communication will be necessary. Parallel authority structures require baseline operational trust to function effectively. I agree completely, I said. My hope is that addressing this situation through institutional mechanisms rather than personal confrontation demonstrates commitment to Meridian's stability rather than individual vindication. As our dinner concluded, James offered a perspective that reflected his decades of corporate governance experience. Elise, in my years overseeing executive transitions, I've observed that true leadership character is revealed not during moments of triumph but during deliberately manufactured crises. How executives respond to orchestrated adversity, whether with reactive accusation or strategic institutional focus, often determines their long-term effectiveness. His implication was clear. My handling of this situation would significantly influence the governance committee's assessment of my leadership capacity beyond the specific client relationship with Zenith. The following morning brought the inevitable confrontation with Victor. He appeared at my office doorway precisely at 8:00 a.m., his expression composed but his posture revealing tension. "Do you have a moment to discuss the Zenith situation?" he asked with practiced professional courtesy. I gestured to the chairs opposite my desk. "Of course. I've been meaning to connect with you on the enhanced governance structure we're implementing for their account." This response, focusing on the solution rather than the orchestrated problem, briefly disrupted his prepared approach. He had clearly anticipated defensiveness rather than forward-focused resolution. "I've received concerning information," he began, recalibrating. Apparently, Helix Group submitted a proposal to Zenith containing methodologies remarkably similar to our proprietary approach. Given your recent reinstatement and the timing of this competitive threat, the coincidence seems worthy of discussion. His framing was masterful, presenting the accusation as concern rather than confrontation, positioning himself as protecting company interests rather than undermining a colleague. "The situation has been addressed," I replied calmly. "Carson, Williams has withdrawn the proposal pending clarification of authorization questions. Lawrence has confirmed enhanced governance protocols with Richard Dawson. The implementation remains on track with no disruption to client confidence." Victor studied me carefully, perhaps surprised by my matter-of-fact response to what he had intended as a destabilizing crisis. "The resolution is encouraging, but the fundamental question remains. How did Helix obtain methodologies identical to our proprietary approach?" This was the trap, the question designed to force either defensive, denial, or damaging admission. Either response would support the narrative he was constructing about my divided loyalties. "That's an excellent question," I agreed, maintaining composed eye contact. "Particularly since the authorization for Helix's outreach was falsified by someone claiming to represent my interests after my reinstatement at Meridian. James Harrison has been briefed on the situation and will likely address it during the governance committee review next week." The subtle shift in Victor's expression confirmed my assessment. He hadn't anticipated my proactive transparency with the board chair, or the reframing of the situation from loyalty question to potential corporate sabotage investigation. "I see," he said carefully. "The governance committee should indeed review all aspects of this situation. Meridian's intellectual property protections are paramount, regardless of the source of potential compromise." The implied threat was clear. The investigation could be directed toward my actions during termination, rather than the subsequent manipulation of those circumstances. It was a calculated escalation designed to maintain leverage despite the initial strategy's failure. "I couldn't agree more," I responded, with genuine conviction. Protecting Meridian's proprietary approaches from both external competition and internal misappropriation is essential to our continued market differentiation. I look forward to the committee's comprehensive review. We maintained this professional, facade of aligned concern throughout the conversation, both recognizing the strategic positioning underlying every carefully chosen phrase. When Victor finally departed, the preliminary battle had reached stalemate, his orchestrated crisis neutralized by my institutional response, my counter-implication of sabotage balanced by his implied threat of intellectual property investigation. The broader significance of this exchange wasn't lost on either of us. The governance committee meeting was now the definitive battlefield for Meridian's leadership future, with this manufactured crisis serving as evidence for competing narratives about organizational health and executive effectiveness. As the day progressed, I maintained absolute focus on operational excellence rather than political positioning. The Zenith implementation team received additional resources to ensure flawless execution. Client communication protocols were enhanced to provide greater transparency into milestone achievement. Leadership meetings emphasized collaborative solutions rather than hierarchical directives. These weren't political maneuvers, but demonstrations of the leadership philosophy I believed would transform Meridian, creating environments where merit received appropriate recognition, where contribution established authority rather than position, where client outcomes mattered more than internal politics. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.